If I were to ask you what killed Jesus, you would probably want to correct me by asking, who killed Jesus? Well, that question, who, has resulted in some of the worst persecutions of Jews in the history of the world, bearing in mind the Holocaust in Germany, for example. They were accused of being Jesus killers. But is that what the Gospel of Mark claims killed Jesus? I don't think so. It's because, really, nearly all the people in the Gospel were Jewish people. Jesus was Jewish. So how can you say that the Jewish people killed Jesus? It makes no sense. So the question remains, what killed Jesus? Well, let's read Mark 15, 1-15, so you can see for yourself what killed Jesus. Now, I've based this on the NIV and have updated it with some readings from the commentaries. It says, very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin had made their decision. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Are you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. You have said so, Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of. But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. So the crowd came up and asked Jesus to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing that it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed him over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews? Pilate asked. Crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder. Crucify him. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He handed Jesus to be flogged and then handed him over to be crucified. Now, as we would say in analyzing a script for a theatrical production, who are the major characters in the story? And the second question is, what motivated each of these characters? It's only by answering those two questions that you can portray it realistically, or that you can understand even what's going on. So let's identify these characters. Now bear in mind that characters doesn't have to be individual people, a person. It can be a group of people, and that's what's happening in our story today. The first, then, is the chief priest who called together the elders and the teachers of the law with the whole Sanhedrin. And there's the character, the Sanhedrin. So we could say that the whole Sanhedrin is the character that we will look at first. They were the religious rulers in Jerusalem. So very early in the morning, it says, well, while it was still night, they convened an unlawful trial against Jesus. It was probably something like 3 in the morning. In Mark 3, 1-6, we see that they had already made the decision way back when that Jesus had to die. Let me read it for you. Here's what it says. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. And why did they want to kill him? It was because he challenged their own disobedience to their own religious law. What Jesus had done was not against their law. Since he had done no work on the Sabbath, he only spoke. The man reaching out his hand did not break their religious rule either. So it's clear that the motivation was not zeal for the law, but envy. They had substituted the idol of their self-concern for what they knew the law of God had given them. The hearts were stubbornly hardened against their own people. Jesus had humiliated them in front of the entire crowd in the synagogue, and so they wanted to do away with him. Now at the trial at night, the high priest had challenged Jesus to admit out loud and publicly who he was. He asked, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus replied, "I am." And he identified himself further by saying he would appear coming from the power in the clouds with great glory. Well, that should have scared him to silence, but of course it didn't. Instead of being scared, they accused Jesus of blasphemy. Blasphemy required death by stoning, but it was not lawful for them under Roman law for them to carry out a capital punishment, so they had to bring him to Pilate, and they had to come up with some charge the Romans would care about. And so they reinterpreted blasphemy to be King of the Jews, and that's what they said Jesus was claiming to be. Now bear in mind that Jesus himself never said that he was the King of the Jews. Actually, he never said he was the Messiah. But he demonstrated it by riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, which was reminding the people of King David riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, and it fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament. He demonstrated that he was in fact their King of the Jews. That, of course, is what Messiah means. And the Jewish people welcomed him into Jerusalem as their Messiah King. And then he took charge of the temple itself by chasing out the merchants who were exploiting the pilgrims by selling extravagantly expensive sacrificial animals in the court of the Gentiles. In all that, Jesus was demonstrating that he was God's chosen Messiah, King of the Jews. But he refused to reveal who gave him this authority, even though it had become obvious by the miracles he had been doing all along. So once again, these religious leaders tried to arrest him, but they couldn't because the people were protecting Jesus. Now, who were these people protecting Jesus? They were just the regular Jewish people and the pilgrims who populate the entire gospel story from the beginning. Okay, so the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, is the first character in this story, but it's not the Jewish people themselves. Now, who is the next character? Well, the Jewish leadership had to come up with this charge of treason in order to get Jesus killed. So the next character is the Roman leadership, the government of Rome, Caesar, and particularly the Roman prefect of Judea, Pilate. He had a problem. He was not in very good graces with Caesar, and in fact later on he had been banished. So he was walking on thin ice over his political career at this time, and he was known to hate the Jewish people and would never do what they wanted him to do, of course. He was known for being very cruel. He could not be seen as being lenient with these rebellious people. He must be seen by Caesar as having a strong hand. To that end, during the Passover festivals, Pilate moved his entourage and himself and his soldiers from his palace in Caesarea to the palace in Jerusalem, the palace of Herod. He did that so he could watch over these restive crowds who came for the festivals of Passover. So these trials with the Sanhedrin and before Pilate took place in this explosive atmosphere of rebellious people against Rome. Many rebellions had already taken place, and Barabbas had taken part in them and been a murderer. Now, poor Pilate. He found himself, as we would say, between a rock and a hard place. He understood that Jesus had been brought to him because the religious leadership was jealous of him, and they wanted to get rid of him. Pilate hated the Jews. He wouldn't do this just because they wanted him to. And he also came to understand that Jesus was innocent of this charge of King of the Jews. So he asked Jesus, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And Jesus, being as canny as ever, answered in a somewhat dangerous way. He said, "You say that I am." Watch out, Pilate. And then Jesus wouldn't defend himself any further. And that amazed Pilate, because it was unusual. And Pilate knew something was up. He couldn't just release Jesus, because that would appear to be lenient, and that's what this crowd wanted him to do. So what did he come up with? He came up with this custom that they've had for a while of releasing a prisoner at Passover time. So he asked the people, "Who do you want me to release?" And he expected them to say Jesus, because Jesus had been popular with the people, as he knew. So there's this third character in the story. It's called the crowd, as opposed to all the people. There was this crowd. Pilate didn't count on the fact that the crowd would never align themselves with any decision that Pilate wanted to make. So it wasn't difficult for the religious leadership to stir up this crowd so that Pilate's position became untenable. He was forced to hand Jesus over for crucifixion and flogging. Now, it may be that flogging was a tactic that Pilate tried to satisfy the crowd instead of crucifying him, but it just inflamed the crowd even more. Crucify him, they said. Now, I'm going to say this again. It's important to remember that this crowd is not the Jewish people, the entire population of Jerusalem and those coming from all over for the Passover. In fact, the Jewish people were protecting Jesus because they had seen that God was with him. Many had seen him raise Lazarus from the dead. And some of those who had witnessed this miracle went and reported it to these religious authorities. Now, this crowd was the kind of people that the religious leadership had stirred up to produce this demand against the innocent man, Jesus. So there we can see the most dangerous combination, religious and political power working together. This combination then becomes a national religion, an idol. And this can manipulate the crowd. It wasn't just the Jewish religion, or not even just Roman paganism. But together, religion and politics were able to sway the crowd any way they wanted them to go, just by stirring them up with the right words. So now, to answer the question from the beginning of this Bible study, what killed Jesus? Have you figured it out yet? Of course you have. It was the combination, the idol of religion and politics working together. Basically, then, it is the idol of self-interest, as Mark would call it, envy or jealousy. Mark reveals that self-interest was the real God that killed Jesus. Now, let's bring this home. When the Americas were colonized, the refugees from the Church of England came to this continent, and instead of the religious freedom they were looking for, they established this same combination of religious power and political power, and they persecuted people who did not agree with them, and even killed some of them. Among those who disagreed and had a lot of problems with this group was a man named Roger Williams. He was one of the first founders of the Baptist churches in the Americas. Later on, as the Constitution of this country was being written, the Baptists wrote to Madison to suggest that he write into law a separation between religion and politics. They wanted to avoid the possibility of a state church as they had been experienced and persecuted in England. They recognized the evil brought about by this idol, this combination of church and state. Madison agreed and did write that in. It is sometimes called the Wall of Separation. It was later called that. And it was also later called the separation of church and state. State, of course, doesn't mean what we mean by states, like the state of Minnesota. It means a country. And in fact, back in that day, each state thought of themselves as a country. So it was quite an unusual thing for them all to gather together to create one country, the United States of America. And so this law that Madison wrote was called the Establishment Clause. I found a quote explaining it, and you can find the reference, the source, and other information in the footnotes of the manuscript that I will include in the comments. Here's what it says. The First Amendment has two provisions concerning religion: the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause prohibits the government from establishing a religion. The precise definition of establishment is unclear. I can't imagine why that would be unclear, but that's what it says. Historically, it meant prohibiting state-sponsored churches, such as the Church of England. The Free Exercise Clause protects citizens' rights to practice their religion as they want to, so long as the practice does not run afoul of public morals or a compelling governmental interest. And that sounds like a big old loophole to me. Now this Establishment Clause, this law written into our government, is so unusual in the history of the world. It's a precious guarantee of religious freedom, or some would like to say freedom from religion. However, in our current political cycles around the world, there's been a growing movement of bringing back these combination, once again establishing the dangerous melding of religion and politics. An American example is something called dominionism, and most people don't even know the name of that word. I've never heard of that. Dominionism. It means that there's a group of Christians who consider that their brand of Christianity, their interpretation of Christianity, should govern the laws of our country. That too simply is the same idolatry, just as it was back when it killed Jesus. The power behind this idol is a spiritual power that's been at work behind the scenes throughout the history of the world. Its seduction is the power of self-interest on the part of those who crave to control the people, or the crowd, as Mark puts it. It's what killed Jesus and persecutes his followers. In Gethsemane, Jesus warned his disciples to watch and pray that they would not enter into temptation. So let me also warn us to watch and pray that we will not enter into this same temptation of self-interest, resulting in the combination of religion and political power. It's not Christian. It's an idol of self-interest. It does not accept the teachings of Jesus regarding how to treat other people. It can appear to be Christian. It can use familiar words. It can even quote scriptures taken completely out of their original contexts. But as Jesus said, you will know them by their fruits. So watch. Watch for what? Watch for their behaviors and the result of their behaviors. So watch and pray. Be careful who you believe. Be careful who you follow. Be careful who you choose to teach you. Does this teacher teach and obey the teachings of Jesus as found in the Gospels? Be very careful who you choose to be the pastor of your church. Does this person want to control everything, or does this person spend themselves ministering to the community as Jesus did? Be very careful in this season who you vote for. Look for the fruit of their words and their actions. Watch out and pray so you won't be manipulated by this idol of self-interest combining religion and political power. Watch out.